All right, well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to welcome you here to the gallery today. My name's Francesca, and I'm the Associate Curator for painting 1600 to 1800 here at the gallery. So I look after our 17th and 18th century holdings. And it's my great pleasure to be talking today at lunchtime about this Canaletto's masterpiece, the Stonemason's Yard of about 1725. And what a location in which to be talking about Canaletto here in room 38, really in the heart of one of the great collections of European view painting. So I want to start today talking a little bit about Canaletto himself, just to give you an idea of his biography, his trajectory, his sort of personal life as an artist. Then I'd love to look closely at this painting to talk about this picture in kind of much more detail and sort of explain really why I've picked this of all our Canalettos to talk about. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about how this painting made its way from Venice here to the walls in Trafalgar Square at the National Gallery. So Canaletto, as you may know, was born in 1697 in Venice, the city with which I think it's fair to say he's now completely synonymous. He was the son of a theatrical scene painter, and his full name was Giovanni Antonio Canal. So Canal is the family surname. Canaletto, the sort of nickname by which we know him, means little canal, or son of canal, and obviously it's a fairly fantastic surname if you're in the business of painting views of Venice. We believe that Canaletto had his earliest training with his father, and he may have trained with other view painters who were working in Venice at the time, possibly an artist called Luca Calvaris. But really, very quickly, Canaletto begins to eclipse all the people who are around him. And by the mid-1720s, he is really the most celebrated painter in Venice, and that's a sort of honor and esteem he'll hold for the rest of his career. He's incredibly well known, incredibly highly thought of, and incredibly highly sought after by Venetian patrons and patrons who are passing through the city. And if you look around you here in room 38, you get a sense, I think, of what it is that Canaletto becomes so famous for. These beautiful grand vistas of Venice, these very large pictures which have just as much a sort of vast expanse of sky as they do the glittering water of the canals. We have the gorgeous perspectives. We have this incredible architectural detail, and these really all become Canaletto's calling cards. And these types of paintings, these big views of Venice, and we call them vedute, which is the Italian for view painting. These vedute become very popular, as I've said, not only with people who are in Venice collecting, but also with people who are passing through. Because, of course, this is the 18th century, and a great many people are traveling, a great many aristocrats are going on what's known as a grand tour, and especially British aristocrats. And now the grand tour could be anywhere from a couple of months to a couple of years. It was a chance, especially for British people who felt they were sort of somewhat marooned in England, to come to Europe to see the great cities, to see the great sites, to see great works of art, to see great masterworks from antiquity right through the Renaissance to the present day. And Canaletto's studio becomes a very important stop on the Grand Tour, because the Grand Tour is not only this kind of extended cultural education, it's also, to some extent, a kind of extended shopping trip, because if you're a British aristocrat and you're going abroad for a period of, 6 months, a year, 2 years, this really is the moment for you to build your collection and bring back to Britain with you all the great things that you've seen on the continent. And Canaletto's views of Venice become absolutely a must-have souvenir. Anyone who goes to Venice must have a view of Venice, of the Grand Canal, of these kind of scenes to take back with them. And Canaletto himself quickly found that these somewhat formulaic views of Venice could be very financially lucrative. So he wasn't working on his own. He had a very large studio. And to say that they're somewhat formulaic is slightly unfair. He's responding to the demands of patrons, but he is also working with assistants so that he can produce these very large works at the speed for which they're being asked. So some of these are paintings that concentrated on Venice's kind of grand spectacles, like the regatta on the Grand Canal. We have Just over there, one of our views of a regatta on the Grand Canal, so you can see Venice in all its kind of pomp and festivity, this great moment of celebration. We actually also in this room have a second version of that same composition, which is just behind you over here on the left of this wall. Sorry, it's a bit like playing Spot the Difference. And if you have time to look afterwards, you'll see that what you might call the bones of the composition are very much the same. So you have the same viewpoint, the same view of the canal, the same buildings, the same gondola race taking place, but it's the details which are very different, and these that are kind of customized, if you will, for different patrons. And as well as these views that are sort of celebrating particular festivities or particular moments, Canaletto's also producing what you might call sort of more day-to-day views of Venice. So our painting of the upper reaches of the Grand Canal with San Simeone Piccolo, which is directly behind you on this wall over here, sorry that you keep having to swivel, is a painting that doesn't show any kind of particular festivities. It's just a very sort of ordinary day. You have gondolas out on the canal, sort of in imminent collision. You've got women hanging out of windows, talking to each other, people gathered in the streets. And I think a picture like that is much more about the sort of ambience of what it's like to be in Venice. And to me, this is what makes the stonemason's yard particularly fascinating because well, as I said, we've been looking around the room. This is quite a different picture, I think. To me, this is always one that really stands out. It's a relatively early Canaletto. To me, it always feels like a slightly mysterious painting. I'll come on to this later, but we really know nothing about this picture during the first 80 years of its existence. So we don't know who it was painted for, we don't know exactly when, we don't know whether it was a commission or whether it's something that Canaletto produced and then found a buyer for, and we certainly have no idea how it got from Venice to Britain. So it has this sort of mystery tied up with it. And it's also the first Canaletto that we got here at the National Gallery. This is the first Canaletto to enter our collection, and to me that's always really interesting. Again, I'll talk about this a bit more, but the National Gallery was founded in the early 19th century. There was, by that point, very much a kind of stereotype of what a painting by Canaletto was and what that might look like. To me, it's very, very interesting that this is the first Canaletto we acquire. Because yes, we have a kind of expanse of blue sky here, but if you look, this is a painting that's dominated, I think at least, by kind of very warm, earthy tones, a very sort of almost rustic palette. It's not a particularly kind of edifying or glorious scene that it's depicting. So I think it's very interesting that this, of all the Canalettos, is the one that came to us first. So what actually are we looking at here in the stonemason's yard? We are actually looking, to be fair, at the Grand Canal. So we're looking over a square, which is known as the Campo San Vidal. That strip of water you see there is the Grand Canal, though it doesn't look particularly grand in this rendering of it. We're not looking up the canal, but sort of across. And what we're looking across to is the Church of Santa Maria della Carità. And so we are absolutely in the heart of Venice, but just not with one of those distinctive Venetian views. And even if you know Venice incredibly well, this is a view that you're not going to be able to find in exactly this form today. The church, Santa Maria della Carità, was secularized during the Napoleonic era. Even in Canaletto's own lifetime, that very sort of striking and distinctive bell tower had actually collapsed twice, so that's not there anymore. And that complex today actually houses the Accademia. So if you've been to Venice and crossed the Accademia Bridge, this is the point now at which that bridge crosses. That building that you see on the far left was demolished to make way for a garden. None of the huts or any of these things are here anymore. This building on the right actually still is, and amazingly, so is this well, which you can just make out here. There's a woman sort of leaning into it to pull out water. That miraculously has survived. But it is otherwise quite a different scene. And so what's going on in the Campo San Vidal at this moment, we think in the mid-1720s when Canaletto's decided to paint it? The English name really gives it away. It's been turned temporarily into a stonemason's yard. So you can see across the kind of space of the square that we've got great big hunks of masonry all over the floor. You've got this very prominent worker's hut here, this sort of temporary wooden building here on the right-hand side of the picture. And across the square, there are various stone workers working with the stone. And we can see that for whatever project they're working on, their stone is at different stages of development. So I'm just going to hop across this. If you come and look at this gentleman here afterwards, he's working on quite a small piece of stone that's already got quite a degree of finish and detail to it. Whereas this man here, who's sort of facing us with a much blunter looking instrument, he's got a much larger, rougher block of stone. He's obviously in an earlier stage of preparation. This is, needless to say, not the age of health and safety. So as well as all the stone and the workers at work here in the square, we've also got down here on the left a mother and her children. In fact, this woman is rushing over because her littlest child has fallen over backwards, perhaps tripped on a piece of stone, perhaps pushed by the rather suspicious and guilty-looking little girl standing next to her, possibly a sibling. But they're clearly very at home here in the Campo San Vidal because both of these children are running around barefoot amidst all this stone and rubble. Again, if you look up just to the left-hand side of the picture, you'll see a woman on the first floor of that apartment leaning out of the window. And you get the sense, I think, that she's leaning out saying, well, what's all the commotion? And we don't quite know whether it's the stone workers who are kind of banging away, making lots of noise, whether it's the wails of this child who's kind of fallen over backwards, or it might be, and this is probably very difficult to make out, but if you look in that bottom window there, it's a sort of black space of a window, you might just be able to make out a rooster sitting on the windowsill, which tells us that this is morning because the roosters come out to crow. So this kind of gorgeous light that we see is a kind of early morning light, and there is in fact on this balcony here on the right-hand side a woman spinning wool, sort of enjoying this moment of relative calm and tranquility in the morning light on her balcony. And to me, that's one of the great joys of this painting, The Stonemason's Yard, is this very kind of ordinary daily life that it depicts. The pleasure that Canaletto's taken in all these details. It's a big picture, you can see that, bigger certainly than the ones it's hanging alongside. But I think at the same time, there's something very intimate about it, that there are these little details that really draw you in, that show you something, as I said, kind of very ordinary and humble taking place. And we can tell that he's very interested in this depiction of daily life because it progresses in stages throughout the picture. So I've mostly been talking about what's happening right here in the foreground. But if you cast your eye back to the canal, we can see that, yes, just kind of daily life is taking place. So there are gondolas going up and down. There's one gondolier who's pulled over to the side to have a chat to his mate on the bank. There's a woman right down over here who's pulling her laundry out of the canal. Can't really say how clean that would be, but she's doing it anyway. Very difficult to make out from a distance, but there's a priest standing in a doorway as if he's coming out of his church, maybe to look at what's going on today, maybe he's meeting somebody. But you get these very sort of charming little vignettes, if you will, of daily life. One of my personal favorite touches is in this area up here in this building on the right-hand side where you have these windows with their white curtains. I think the use of white is really clever because it's bright and it pulls our eye over there. And you can see that in the window nearest to where I'm standing, the curtain is sort of waving in the breeze. The next window along, it seems to have got sort of rucked up somehow on the balustrade. And the third white curtain you hardly see because on that balcony, and we don't know who it belongs to, somebody's taken great, great care to arrange an enormous quantity of potted plants, which I think is just such an adorable detail, not only that someone would have bothered to do it, but that Canaletto in turn has taken the time to paint all these little pot plants in. It's very, very sweet. Further in the background, you can see a chimney smoking. You might be able to make out another flash of white here, where there's some laundry, again, kind of flapping on the breeze. And to me, I think that laundry kind of, in a way, says something about this picture. Not that Venice is airing its dirty laundry per se, but that you get a sense of people carrying on with no regard to the fact that they're being painted. And certainly, it's not a particularly edifying subject, it's not particularly grand, but I think Canaletto's taken a real pleasure in painting it, a real pleasure with all these details. Nothing of these people's lives feels mean or dirty, but he seems really to have enjoyed painting it. And I think you get a real sense of that if you come and look closely, particularly at things like the brickwork. So as I've said, this painting is kind of dominated by this reddy brown, very warm palette. It's not the kind of cool, pale stone you might think of with the kind of grand palaces you see on the canals. And you can see that he's done kind of extraordinary things with his paint, particularly this building on the left here. Just underneath that chimney at the top, there's actually sort of stains on the brickwork, sort of dribbling down onto the red brick. Further down, that sort of plaster has crumbled away to reveal exposed bricks. And if you look very closely in this area, where you sort of get the mix of the red and the pale coloured stone, you can see that actually he's using the weave of the canvas, so the actual kind of texture, the surface of what he's painting on, to give you the effect of kind of crumbling stone and age. So I think there's clearly a lot of enjoyment in these details for the artist and for the viewer. And I think the sense that we get here, as I've said, is of a kind of real Venice, an ordinary Venice, an everyday Venice. And that is in large part down to these details, to the meticulous care and attention that Canaletto's spent in making them. But I think it's also worth mentioning his use of optics, because it's something that always comes up talking about Canaletto, talking about his contemporaries. The idea that these very sort of perfect feeling perspectival scenes were often created with the help of or use of some kind of optical device. That being said, it's an absolutely enormous topic and it can get quite controversial, and I don't want to go into the kind of deep science of the early kind of cameras that these artists were using. But suffice to say, from about the mid-17th century onwards, so from about 75 years before this was painted, it was very, very common for view painters to use some kind of optical device when preparing these great panoramic views that you see around you. And this could be as simple as, when I say camera, I don't mean anything like the kind of technology we have today. You know, you're essentially talking about a wooden box with a mirror in it and a hole so that you can kind of get the lay of the land. And I think now we tend to get a bit snooty about the idea of optics, and you sort of think, oh, well, gosh, is that cheating if you've copied somehow the fantastic perspective that you're seeing in front of you? But contemporaries don't seem to have felt this. They're very open about the fact that people are using optical devices. So early biographers of Canaletto tell us that he's using them. But the difference for them is that it is not enough simply to set up your camera obscura, your camera optica, and to kind of sketch out the perspective and then reproduce that exactly on the canvas. What the artist has to do is to actively improve it. And I think the quote is actually to correct the defaults of the perspective. So there's a lot of work involved. And it is worth saying that while the preparatory work for a scene like this, in fact, everything we see around us would have been done on site, actually the paintings take place in the studio, because the studio is the place where you take these preparatory studies and you mix them with invention and intellect and everything you're doing as an artist to make the scene perfect. So here, you can, for as much as the space has changed, you can actually go back and find the spot where Canaletto would have done the preparatory drawings for this. It's worth saying that the stonemason's yard is unique within his oeuvre. So this is a view that he only painted once. He didn't replicate it. He didn't come back to this scene. And we know that he's chosen quite a high viewpoint. So if you look again at that woman leaning out of her window on the first floor of that building, that's about the height that he is in order to capture this perspective. And in this instance, he's only stood in one place to get the perspective. And that's not always true. And if you come and look, as I said, at some of the canal scenes afterwards, it was quite common for Canaletto to take a view, say, looking down the Grand Canal, to look at that side from one point and do the perspective for that, and then look at this side and do another. And then in the studio, he kind of combines these together. So for many of his paintings, there is no one perfect point where you can go and stand and see it exactly as he painted it. He's doing this work, as I've said, to improve, to correct, to make it perfect in the studio. And the reason they feel so perfect, although the perspective is to some extent invented, is, I think, largely down to his meticulousness and these details and these things that just kind of make you believe in the scene as it is. So I want to talk briefly about who this painting might have been for. As I've said, we date it to the mid-1720s, and that's for a number of reasons, partly to do with style, so kind of stylistic reasons, partly because the consensus among art historians is that this is an early work, but it can't be that early because it's so magnificent, so it sort of has to kind of end up in that mid-1720s, possibly stretching to about 1730, but really probably before that moment. And also because we do know that there was masonry work, stonework happening in this area of Venice around this time. Unfortunately, it kind of dragged on over several years, so it's not a short piece of work that gives us the exact date for the painting, but we're pretty confident that this is probably painted around 1725. And like I said, we have no idea whether it was a commissioned work or whether it was something that Canaletto produced and then found someone to buy. We've no idea who owned it during the first 80 years of its existence. We don't know how it made the 1,000-mile trip from Venice to England. And the first kind of reference we have to this painting is in 1808, when it's recorded in the collection of Sir George Beaumont, who was a landscape artist and collector, and actually someone who turns out to be enormously important for the National Gallery. So he not only had a big role in bringing this painting here, but many others as well, and I will come back to him. But just to kind of finish this thought of who this was painted for, the consensus is very much that it must have been for a Venetian collector, because there is something so intimate, so kind of real Venice about this, that people, we just don't feel this would have been a view that a tourist would have wanted to take home. It's probably not even a scene that a tourist would have actually visited or seen in person. So the feeling is that it was made for someone in Venice who would have appreciated this somewhat unorthodox kind of view. And I also just want to say, please don't be fooled by the sort of somewhat humble subject matter and these not very edifying buildings and bits of stone. This is absolutely considered to be the height of Canaletto's achievements in the early part of his career. It is repeatedly called his masterpiece for his whole career, let alone just the early part. Some people have even waxed lyrical, saying, my goodness, this is what Canaletto would have done, this is where he would have gone if it hadn't been for all those British dukes and aristocrats wanting these endless views of the Grand Canal. So but yes, please don't be fooled by the sort of dirt and stone and the kind of bare ground you see here. This is very much the peak of his achievements as an artist. So as I said, the first record that we have of this painting is in 1808, when it is in the collection of Sir George Beaumont, who is a painter, collector, and he's one of the people who's really agitating in Britain for the establishment of the National Gallery. So many of you may know that the National Gallery was founded in 1824 and founded explicitly to be a national institution. So this makes us quite different from, say, the Musée du Louvre in Paris or the Museo del Prado in Madrid. Those are wonderful collections, but they were based on royal collections. There's institutions that kind of inherited a royal collection, which was then made public. Not the case with us here. Every single one of the paintings you see on our walls was acquired specifically for the national collection, either purchased by us or donated to us. So when the gallery was founded in 1824, it's a very big project, because you have to equal the Louvre and the Prado. It's a great work to be undertaking. So the foundation of the gallery, the kind of nucleus of our collection, comes from the collection of a very rich banker and collector called John Julius Angerstein. And he had amassed this spectacular collection of old master paintings. And around 1824, there was a lot of worry in this country because Angerstein had died, and it was felt that his collection was in danger of being sold out of the country. And so there was great petitioning, and the government of the day, in fact, agreed to buy his collection of paintings to form a nucleus of the National Gallery. And where Sir George Beaumont comes in is that he, in 1823, had promised his collection, again, a spectacular collection of old master paintings, to the nation on the condition that a space could be found to house them and that the government would undertake their kind of care and preservation in perpetuity. So once the gallery is founded, Beaumont kind of comes good on his promise, and the Stonemason's Yard is one of a group of pictures that comes to the National Gallery, not to this building, because we weren't based here at that point, but comes to the National Gallery in 1828. Now, if you visited the gallery last summer, you might have had a chance to visit our exhibition Painters Paintings, which was taking place in the Sainsbury Wing. And this was an exhibition that we organized looking at a very large number of works, actually, in our collection, which had been owned at some point in their history by artists. And I think this is a kind of idea that has enduring appeal, that there are certain paintings that are by artists, but speak to other artists in a very particular way, whether that's to do with the subject or the technique. And there's obviously, a kind of infinite number of reasons why an artist might buy someone else's painting. It could be as inspiration, it could be to support a fellow artist, it could be to kind of glorify their own reputation, it could be out of a kind of obsession. But I think it's an idea that sort of still has a lot of currency for us today, this idea there are certain pictures that kind of speak amongst artists. And as I said, Beaumont, who owned this, was an artist himself. But interestingly enough, the very early history in Britain of this painting suggests that it may also have had another artistic connection, possibly even another artistic intervention. So if you go down after we've finished into room 34, it's a big room at the end in which we house 18th century and early 19th century British paintings, you would see on the walls a painting by John Constable called A Cenotaph to the Memory of Sir Joshua Reynolds. Sir Joshua Reynolds, who's the founding president of the Royal Academy here, very, very important 18th century artist. And Constable in the 1830s paints a painting of a cenotaph, a sort of memorial stone that had been erected to Reynolds' memory. And this stone actually really exists, this cenotaph, and it existed at Cole Orton Hall in Leicestershire, which was Sir George Beaumont's country seat. And we know that in 1823, Constable had paid an extended visit to Beaumont at Cole Orton Hall. That's the date at which he first sketches the cenotaph that he then turns into the painting in room 34. But we also know he was doing other things with Beaumont's Old Master collection at the time. So in his diary for the 21st of November, 1823, Constable writes, "I've got an old picture to fill up some holes in." Very intriguing. And we know in a letter sent around the same time that he's saying, I'm just going to be 2 or 3 more days here at Cole Orton because I have some work to do on the pictures. It's not clear, he doesn't specify which picture it is. But if you've been looking at the sky in this painting, if you're very, very eagle-eyed, you might have thought, that's unusual, because Canaletto doesn't normally paint these moody blue-grey clouds. And if you look around the rest of the room, his clouds tend, on the whole, to be kind of lighter, fluffier, whiter in colour. And we do in fact know from technical analysis that parts of the sky in this picture, particularly these kind of moody grey-blue clouds, have been repainted at some point since Canaletto painted them. Unfortunately, the pigment analysis doesn't tell us anything groundbreaking. Sometimes you have the great good luck to find a pigment that was only invented in such and such a specific date, and then it really helps. This is not the case here. The pigments, I think it's a Prussian blue amongst other things, had been in use in Canaletto's lifetime. But certainly for us, it's a very intriguing thought to think that this might have been a picture in which Constable's filling up a bit of a hole in the sky, repainting in November of 1823. Just before finishing, I want to say a little bit more about Canaletto, because I've been banging on about Canaletto as a Venetian artist, and I think that is absolutely how we see him. As I've said, it's the city with which he becomes synonymous, but it would do him a disservice, I think, to pretend that he only spends time in Venice during his career. So we know that in 1742 he actually travels to Rome and he makes paintings in Rome. He's also in that same year kind of making more trips to the mainland from Venice. And it's also a year in which he takes up etching. So for someone who's spent pretty much 2 decades working in Venice, producing these big vedute, these big view paintings, it's interesting to think that around 1742 somehow he seems to be getting sort of itchy artistic feet. And it seems that he's looking for a new challenge, and the new challenge comes to him really in 1746 when he embarks for England. And this is a very significant trip for Canaletto. It's a very significant part of his career, and he spends the next 9 years, bar one return visit to Venice, exclusively in Britain. And it's, in spite of the kind of initial skepticism of the British art market, it's an enormously successful period for Canaletto. So he not only connects with patrons who he's met in Venice, so these grand tourists who've been passing through, he looks them up and reconnects with them, but he also finds new patrons. Not being in Venice is no way a hindrance. He's still producing views of Venice, even though he's in England. But he's also producing English views. And we're lucky enough to have 2 of them here at the gallery. And I just want to say a few words about them, because they are paintings that I think give you a different sense of Canaletto. So we have a beautiful view here of Eton College in Windsor, and then down here on the far left, we have the Rotunda at Ranelagh, which was here in London. It was part of a kind of pleasure gardens complex in Chelsea in the 18th century, which no longer exists. But I think to me, it's important always to look at these as well as the views of Venice, because I think it just gives us that slightly different perspective on Canaletto. You get a slightly different feel from those pictures. He did return to Venice after his 9 years in England, so he goes back in 1755 when he's in his late 50s, and he keeps working. In 1763, he is admitted to the Venetian Painters Academy, which is really extraordinarily late if you consider how long he's been working and how famous he is and how international his reputation is. But he's admitted in 1763, and he seems very pleased by this. There's a fabulous painting from these late years in Hamburg, which he's signed and then inscribed, painted age 68 without spectacles. And to me, that always seems a very charming detail of Canaletto. He was so proud that even at 68, he's still painting his views, possibly with the aid of optics, but without spectacles, an important distinction. And then he dies in 1768, aged 71. And I think, again, it's worth saying that for all his fame during his lifetime, for all his international reputation, for all, the name recognition now, 250 years after his death, and if I say to you Canaletto, you're immediately thinking of those views of Venice. He actually died in quite humble circumstances, and his inventory and things after death don't seem to show that he had any kind of great fortune after all these years, these decades of hard work on these wonderful Venetian view paintings. So thank you very, very much for listening today. If anybody has any questions, I will hang around for a few moments and be very happy to answer them. But my entreaty to you is please come and look closely at some of these pictures. Look at the ceremonial, the spectacular Venice, look at the views of the Grand Canal as the British might have wanted them, but then come and look at this, because it is a masterpiece. It's a very, very different type of painting, and to me, every time I look at it, I see something new, and I just get a slightly more complicated view of who Canaletto is as an artist. But thank you very much and enjoy your visit today.